Welcome to our panel discussion today. My name is Kathy Little. I'm from CBC Radio, and I'm very pleased to be here to moderate our discussion. We are recording this, and we will broadcast it at a later date on Wild Rose Country. Now, in the dictionary, adventure is defined as a bold and difficult undertaking involving unknown risks and danger. So it's no wonder that adventure and mountaineering lore is full of tragic stories. But there are some spectacular near-tragic experiences as well. The ones that you're invited out to dinner to talk about, the ones your kids may groan at after the 10th or 20th telling, or the ones that years later still keep you awake at night. Our five panelists today certainly have had their fair share of gut-wrenching and hair-raising experiences, prolonged storms, lost equipment, falls, avalanches, even life-threatening moments of simple carelessness. They obviously have lived to tell the tale. They've thought about what went wrong and why, and they've learned from their experiences, and we hope to learn from their experiences today as well. So let me introduce you, first of all, to the stars of today's show. On my very far left, we have Timmy O'Neill, a climber. Thank you, Timmy. He's a little shy. A buildering enthusiast and a filmmaker. Next to Timmy, we have Sir Ranulph Fiennes, a renowned explorer, an expedition leader, and author. Arlene Blum, an expedition leader as well, an environmental chemist and an author. And Geoff Powter, very well known, I'm sure, to this audience. He's from Canmore. He's a climber, writer, psychologist, and a veteran of this particular festival. And next to me, Steve House, alpinist and leading Himalayan climber. So welcome to you all, and thanks for coming to. We're going to begin today with Geoff Powter and his story, because it's this particular story that actually led to the idea for this panel of near tragedy, what we can learn from those kinds of experiences. Geoff?
Thank you, Kathy. The thing that I want to talk about happening is something that I've been mulling over for the past couple of years, and I think that's the reason why I first thought about bringing a group of people together to talk about their similar experiences, because I think the reason that we're all up here is not so much that there's anything special about us, but rather that we've all had something happen that I think all of us have the capacity to have happen, which is just to come that close to something going really wrong. And in my case, the thing I've been thinking about for a couple of years now was an accident that I had in Yosemite in the spring a couple of years ago. At the end of a long day where I'd been doing a very different kind of climbing, climbing a big wall with a lot of attention to detail and a lot of real strong focus on the moment and very, very minute kind of placements, and just several days of real incredible attention to very small things and a lot of kind of below the surface kind of anxiety going on. I decided with my partner as we came down to the parking lot that we wanted to go free climbing instead and just go out there and just enjoy pure movement on rock. What I didn't take into account was how tired I was, or the circumstances of being in communication with my partner, and how casual we'd kind of become after spending several days together on a wall. And we finished our climb together. It was a relatively short, one pitch kind of thing, although as you see, it turns out to be a little bit longer than I thought it was. And got to the top of the climb. I set up our rope. We just kind of continued on our banter. We knew, because we'd seen some other people come down the climb, that it was absolutely no problem to rappel. What I did not realize was that my partner's rope was not as long as it should have been. He had shortened it because it had been chopped in an ice climbing incident the year before. He rappelled down out of my vision, said nothing. I had no idea what was going on. He just said he was off belay. I clipped into off rappel. I clipped into the rope and started heading down. And we're all familiar with doing this. It's really straightforward to rappel. You just go down. The other person's already gone down. It's totally safe. So I just whizzed down the rope and came straight off the end of the rope, about 30 feet off the ground. The landing was, I'd heard this described by somebody else in terms of a fall once. This was like falling into the seating area of a convertible made of stone. And I don't know exactly how I survived. I have no idea. I know that my head touched rock, but I wasn't left with a scrape. I broke a bunch of ribs on one side because I'd bent over a rock on the ground. I skinned my knee and my elbow, but I fell so far. How I lived through that, I have absolutely no idea. I know because my head hit, I was within just a couple of feet of complete rotation, head down, and obviously I wouldn't be here if that had happened from that kind of height. But what was interesting to me, I think about that, and really the spark for this panel is what happens afterwards when you go through that, because I've been processing this, like I said, for a couple of years now, just trying to figure out how I get back in the saddle again, how I deal with trying to resurrect myself and how to sort that out in my own mind. But I certainly know one thing that I'll just add as a closing comment, that when I think of myself as being an idiot for having gone through that fall, I think it's not just because I wrapped off the end of the rope. That's idiotic, no question about that. Good thing not to do. It's not just because I trusted my friend, my partner, to tell me that the rope wasn't long enough. I mean, that's something maybe I shouldn't have done, but maybe he should have said it to me. I'm not sure. But I think one of the interesting things from a psychological point of view about the accident for me was that the idiocy for me was recognizing how many times in 31 years of climbing I've thought about that. I thought about coming off the end of a rope, and I had this ridiculous idea, now that I think about it, having lived through it more or less, that I would come off the end of a rope, because we've all dreamt about this kind of thing, and at just the last minute I'd throw out a hand and I'd grab a jug and I'd hold on, and then I'd swing and I'd get back on the rope again, and you don't. You come off so fast and so hard, I have no recollection whatsoever of leaving the end of the rope or of hitting the ground. All I know is I stood up and I swore really loudly, and that's all that happened.
Thank you, Geoff, and we'll be talking a little bit more about what you've learned from that experience. Arlene, let's hear from you, your tale of near tragedy.
Well, mine was a long time ago on Denali in 1970. This was the first all-woman attempt on Denali, and it was a time when I had not been allowed to go on several expeditions. The general belief in those days was that women were not physically strong enough to do things like run marathons or climb Denali. I'd indeed been told on a guided expedition women could go to base camp and help with the cooking. So I organized a women's Denali trip, and you had to look far in those days to find 6 women, and we were thrilled to get as our leader an Alaskan woman, Grace Homan, who had done the hardest climbs in Alaska. And she told me she had been sent back twice on Denali at about 14,000 feet due to sexism, and because of my experience, I believed her. But it turned out she was someone who had an altitude barrier. She couldn't really climb well above 14,000 feet. So anyway, we climbed up Denali with our heavy loads, and we were really doing great. And Grace was not doing great. She was getting weaker and weaker, and really couldn't carry her loads, but we kept going. And she was a doctor. She's our doctor and our trip leader, taking lots of medicines. I was the assistant leader, but I was 25, she was 50, and she was the boss. So finally, we got up to the summit, and she collapsed unconscious just below the summit. And suddenly, I was the expedition leader at age 25, with an unconscious person near the summit of Denali, and a big storm coming in. And not a good situation, but we made a stretcher of a climbing rope and a pack frame, and we hauled her down to just above a very steep section above Denali Pass. And then a couple people went down to see if there was anyone at Denali Pass to help. And another woman, Faye, and I were left with Grace, who was unconscious. And we saw big storm clouds around us. And so what do you do on Denali with an unconscious person and a storm coming in? And it seemed like it could be fatal for her and maybe us too. Do you stay or do you leave? So it was a real dilemma. Fortunately, one of our team and a strong Seattle guy from who was at Denali Pass came up, and Grace was a little bit better. We got her down. As we got lower, she got stronger, and it all turned out okay. But it had a lot of repercussions, which I will save for when we talk later.
All right, thanks very much, Arlene. Now, Steve House, I believe you have a story about the classic slippery slope?
Other than this one?
Other than this one.
Yeah, as usual with most, I think, of these climbing stories, it ultimately just starts with a desire to climb a mountain. And for me, it was the mountain that's actually the poster of the film festival, the Petite Dru in the Chamonix Alps. And I really wanted to climb the north face of the Dru that summer, and I had a number of blocks of time scheduled in. And each time one of these little blocks of time between my work came up, the weather was bad. And it was the end of the season, and the last block of time, of course, again, the weather was bad. So on the fourth day, the last day, I decided, well, I'm clearly not going to be able to climb. I'll go learn the approach. I'll go scout it out so I can have a better chance next year. So I went up the Grand Monté lift and thought the best approach was to go down this 2,000 feet of scrambly rock climbing and then cross the glacier to the base of the north face there. And there's a couple inches of fresh snow, and I got down all the rock okay. And that was a little technical, so I had to pay attention. I was really focused. But then I got to the glacier, and the glacier, it's pretty easy. It's only inclined like 25, 30 degrees. So I just had my ice axe out, and I didn't have crampons on, and I just had light boots and a really light day pack, and I was just out for the day. And I stepped on to the glacier, and what I didn't realize was that underneath the bit of snow, that was a really hard, slick veneer of water ice. And so I almost instantly slipped, like Geoff described, and started sliding down this glacier, and then after about 20 feet, I fell into a large crevasse. And I just started to get into self-arrest when my feet dropped into the crevasse. And so as I was falling, I was rotating around, and I landed on a snow bridge on my head, and I kind of like pile drove into the snow and tore a bunch of muscles on a leg and was in a lot of pain. And what the image that really sticks in my mind, though, is when I finally got myself sort of extricated. I was really freaked out about this bridge, that it might collapse. And I got myself to where I could see and realized that there was just this bridge about as wide as this table, and probably about as long. And on both sides of it was just nothing, just the abyss going down into the crevasse. So had I been a few feet either direction, or had the snow bridge been a little weaker, I would have died. And then I had spent the rest of the day extricating myself from the crevasse, getting my crampons back on my boots was really difficult with the injuries, climbing out of the crevasse, and then hopping on one leg 2,000 feet back up to the lift, which I made just about 10 minutes before the last lift of the day. And a kind Frenchman drove me to the hospital, and it put me out for quite a while. I was pretty badly injured, and I wasn't unable to work in my profession of a mountain guide for almost a year. And so I had a lot of time to think. But
Think about it. Okay, we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that in our second part of the discussion. We know who to blame in your case, though. We know where the blame goes. Okay. Timmy O'Neill, we'll turn to you now.
Was anybody here for Radical Reels on Tuesday night? Well, then, you would have seen my most recent near miss with Hans Ray about to crush my private parts. Yeah, but that's for another time. The setting is Pakistan. It's the Karakoram, home of the largest glaciers and the largest granite spires in the world. The location is also Nameless Tower. It was 2000. It was the summer. I was there with a 19-year-old kid named Miles Smart, and we decided to do a speed ascent, which essentially means climbing as fast as you can to the top of the particular summit you're gunning for. And we were using a technique called short fixing, which the particulars aren't important for this discussion, but the result is going as fast as you can with the least amount of equipment, generally much smaller and much less than what you think would be possible. So in order to do this and use this system, you have to run it out, which means that you have maybe 30 or 40 or 50 feet in between pieces of protection. So we were at about 19,000 feet in elevation, and it was maybe we'd been climbing for about 12 or 14 hours at this point, and I was in the lead. And we lead in blocks as well, which means one guy's responsible for doing about 500 feet of rock, say, multiple pitches. And I have the rope fixed. I'm leading off. Miles is busy below me, mechanically ascending the rope. And I'm on this 12-foot wide ledge, about 3 feet across, and I start aid climbing up it, putting in these really small stoppers into this really incipient crack. And we had attempted the route 2 days previous. So I look up above, and there's a fixed stopper. So in order to save time, because we're speed climbing, I decide to clip into that fixed piece. But instead of testing it and seeing if it was good, I assumed it was. And below me is this ledge. I'm about 15 feet above it. And I have more than half the rope just coiled on the ledge below me. And I have just the anchor, which the rope is connected to, and then this stopper that I'm about to step on. So as I step onto the stopper, it just pulls right out of the crack. And I fall onto my daisy chain, which is connected to this other small stopper, which is keeping me about 100 feet, from taking this massive 100-foot plus fall. And as I come into contact with that, bam, it snaps right out of the crack. I fall about 12 feet to the ledge, stick it, pull some of my fingernails off as I try and clutch onto the ledge, and then begin free falling down the face. And here's Miles on the other side of the line, watching me fly past him. Holy smokes, he's thinking, there goes Timmy, he's dead for sure. And it's the fall was so far that I had to breathe like several times. I was like, ah, 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 how long is this gonna take? And I'm thinking for sure I'm going to the deck, which is like thousands and thousands of feet below. But sure enough, I feel like the maple syrup stretch of the rope, like coming in. And I drop over this roof, and I come down, fly past, and smash into the wall, and the rack smashes me in the face. And I'm just lying there, or sitting there lifeless on the rope. And Miles is like, Timmy's dead for sure, okay? This sucks, And I'm like, kind of coming to, sort of like coming back into my body, if you could imagine it, because I thought for sure I was a goner. And I'm coming to, and I'm like, and I start cussing, and I'm really angry, and I don't know what's going on, and then I finally become totally aware of what's going on, and I go, Miles, I'll be right up, dude. Just give me a minute. But sure enough, I was totally worked. I thought I'd broken my shoulder. I thought I'd broken my pelvis, but what it was, I just ripped a bunch of pubic hair out, so it was... No, it was painful. The harness just ripped. It shredded me. It was horrible. I have a landing strip now. Oh, anyway. So then we enacted a self-rescue, Miles lowering me down, pitch after pitch after pitch. And then when we got to the shoulder, we ran into a team of Mexican climbers, and they continued with the rescue. That's my story.
Thank you very much. Some of this won't be rebroadcast later on Wild Rose Country. Sir Ran, that is a tough act to follow, but you are the person to do it, I know.
Yeah, it is a tough act to follow, not just Timmy, but all of them, because they have the element of terror which is induced by Isaac Newton, which is... I don't have this because I had a near miss 2 feet above sea level, which might make you think that I'm pretty stupid. What happened was, I can't remember when it was, about 2002 maybe, I had been worried because our rivals for polar firsts at that time looked as though he was going to do the first solo to the North Pole unsupported from the North American side. The Russian side had already been done. Basically, from the Russian side, you can expect to float to the North Pole if you can sit long enough on a bit of ice. But from the Canadian side, you're going the other way. So if you sleep, you lose ground because your ice flow will take you backwards. So that's probably, and it was called the direct route. The Russian side's called the drift route. So I was trying to do the direct route, and I decided that the reason it hadn't been done in the past was because people set out too late from northern Ellesmere Island, which, as you know, is in Canadian territory, from Ward Hunt Island, which is an uninhabited island from which most people who want to try and go to the North Pole set out. Now, I arrived there about a month earlier than was normal to set out when the sun comes up, which was on March the 7th. I thought that if I set out very early, then I'd get quite a long way, if you treat this thing as being the North Pole, quite a long way towards it before the sun started deteriorating the ice and making lots of open water, which makes it difficult, obviously, to ski to the pole. So by setting out early, I thought I was quite clever, and I thought I'll also do my first week's attempt during the period of the full moon, because that will give me more light. So there I was, I had 2 sledges, 500 pounds in all. One sledge was 300 pounds, the other was 200 pounds, which had enough food to get me all the way to the pole if things went well. So after a few days, the moon, unfortunately, was covered by clouds. So there was a full moon. I wasn't taking advantage of the light. What also happens, you probably know, is that the full moon makes the sea come up, which splits all the ice on top of the sea. So if you're traveling on the ice, it's actually quite a bad time to travel is the full moon, which I now know. Being by myself, the temperature that night was minus 49. There was a breeze of about 10 miles an hour, which makes it quite cold. So obviously you've got to keep going. Your metabolism makes you warm as long as you are going. And then there was a lot of activity from the ice. Very noisy. It's like sort of Concorde or Tchaikovsky's 1812, if you're classical, and not good for your imagination. And I thought, by torchlight, that the ice that I was on was cracking up in a very bad way, and I thought that the northerly-most flow away from me was safer to get onto. Ice on the sea grows at 3 feet a year, so a multi-year flow is probably over 9 feet because it's an over 2-year-old ice flow. And that looked good, so I was trying to get to it. But in between my flow and it was the fact that the 2 flows were gradually going apart from each other, and I wanted to get onto the northerly one before they completely parted, because in between was all this mush ice, which is blocks of, shall we say, 3 foot by 3 foot ice, too heavy to pick up, but lots of them, and they were forming a bridge. And there was about 10 foot from the top of the bridge over which I wanted to cross before it slowly collapsed down. And so I started out, I took the heavier of the 2 sledges first, and on the top of this sort of moving lot of ice blocks, the sea, Black Sea being 10 foot below, my sledge unfortunately slipped sideways, and being a lot heavier than me, dragged me off the top of the bridge, down the sort of sloping ice slopes towards the sea, which I obviously didn't want to go into. And the sledge went straight down into it, and I was tied to it by a dog harness, like people are. And so I hit the release mechanism on the front to release it, and only one of my feet went into the water. I then scrabbled my way up to the top of it again and realized that my method of survival was a pup tent and an MSR cooker. Those 2 things would stop me getting hypothermia. And when you're not pulling, you're wearing Vental, not Gore-Tex, because you don't want to sweat. And so you very, very quickly get into a hypothermic position. So I realized I'd have to get the tent and the cooker out of the sledge, which was floating just below the surface of the water, with ice blocks having fallen in on top of it. So I scrabbled back down again towards the water on my stomach and tried to get it out, but found that the sledge was actually snagged, or the rope was, under the water. So the only way I could get it out was to fish around underneath the water, which I did. And while my hand was in the water, it was quite warm, sort of -2, because otherwise the water would freeze. And when I got it out again, having unsnagged the rope, I had to pull the 300-pound wet sledge up a sort of bank of slithery ice to get it up on top again. And it was during this process of pulling that the life went out of my hand completely. Anyway, to cut a long story short, when I got back up to the top again, my hand was like wood, literally, and I couldn't do the normal thing, which is to centrifuge your fingers by swinging them round and round, or put them into your crutch, which was also quite cold by then, or normally there's 2 of you, so you could put it in someone else's crutch, but
The other panelists are moving away from Sir Ran right now.
Okay, to carry on. At that particular point, I realized that there was no life in that hand, but the other hand was rapidly getting cooler, and I was getting cooler, so I had to try and, which seems very simple talking about it now, to get the tent up and the cooker going to try and get some life back into the other hand before. So I don't know if quite a lot of you probably have tried when you've got very cold hands to put the poles into the sleeves of a small North Face tent. I managed to get 2 in before the life sort of went completely out of the other hand. And I was shivering and shaking and in a pretty bad way. Didn't have much time before I would have useless hands. But I got 2 of the hoops into the tent, so although it was saggy-baggy, it was enough to get in away from the wind. I got the MSR cooker in and tried to start it. And as you know, not modern ones, but in those days, you've got to have the right amount of fuel, otherwise it either has too much and you get a big flame, or too little, in which case you've got to start it again. In this case, I couldn't do it, so I put... this hand was useless. I put one of the cooker in my mouth and used the other hand to go like that. I then found that the cooker naturally had stuck, so I pulled it away and the lip came with it. And, but in those circumstances, you're more worried about actually getting the flame going. So I then lit it, and voomp, there was a 4-foot flame which burnt the tent. So at that moment, I was very unhappy with the whole setup. And... So somehow or other, it got down to a proper flame, and then you got heat, and you're in some sort of a container. And I looked at the circumstances, and I realized I'd have to get out. The flow that I was on was disintegrating fairly rapidly, but until it did, I was going to stay inside that tent. The other sledge I couldn't find anywhere, and I realized I'd be better off without the sledge, and I managed to, after 3 hours, get the tent back and put it into a rucksack, and I got back to dry land after a pretty nightmarish journey, and eventually, realizing that one hand had gone, or some of it had, I got back to the Ward Hunt Island hut, about, don't know how many miles away, put the tent up inside the hut, got a radio eventually through to Bradley Air Services, and if any of you know Bradley, it's a wonderful company, and their Swiss pilot, legendary guy called Carlsberg, said if I could put some stuff out on the ice and burn it, 2 of them, he would manage to land in the dark, which he did do. And I spent 3 weeks in Ottawa Hospital, and the insurance in the UK said that they wouldn't pay for the operation in Canada, which is pretty stupid because Canadians have lots of good surgeons at frostbite, and in the UK we don't have any at all. So, but I went back to UK, and fortunately there was a Maltese surgeon who naturally could do frostbite. And so I was about to have the amputation done on half the thumb and half the fingers on one hand when a bright spark from Portsmouth Navy divers, who'd cut off a lot of their fingers over his time, said you must not have the operation for 5 months after the damage. And so 5 months later, it was set to have the fingers removed. And that was just a 3-minute mistake, really, in 32 years of polar mucking about. Yeah.
Fascinating. My goodness. You wonder why people like this do what they do and continue doing it, especially after these near tragic experiences, or in some instances there is tragedy involved. So Geoff alluded to this at the start, that after an experience like that, you have time to think about it, and you have time to think about what went wrong and why it went wrong, and what you can learn from it. And Geoff, you were mentioning in your story about introspection. You know, when you get through something like that, you stop and you think about it. What makes you do it, or can you do it again? So Geoff, when you go through an experience like you went through, what do you think after? How do you sort of get back into it?
Well, one of the first questions is whether I want to get back into it again at all or not. But to me, there actually wasn't that much of a question about that, Kathy. Sorry, there was. I knew absolutely that I wanted to get back to it, but I was faced with a couple of different questions. One of them was, is there something that I could do differently again in the future? And that was relatively easy. I started looking at all the circumstances that led up to what happened to me, and a lot of the work that gets done on accidents, why people make mistakes the way that they do, tends to suggest that accidents typically in industry and lots of other areas are about one small mistake leading to another one, or even just one small judgment leading to another one, and things start snowballing to the point where it's almost inevitable that something will happen. in my case, it was about, again, being tired, being on a very different kind of climb first, and then changing the rules without really changing what I was doing differently. So I just implicitly trusted somebody because we'd been in such close contact for all that time. And I really let my attention drop because I didn't need to have as much attention, I thought, as I did when I was on the wall. So I was just a lot more casual about what I was doing and did some things because now it was just easy free climbing that I absolutely would not have done 3 hours before that. The other question that absolutely came up is the question of blame. And by that I mean blaming somebody else rather than just blaming myself. And what I've been thinking about for the past couple of years in this is just the question of who that serves, or what kind of purpose does that serve? Because it was really interesting. Right after the accident, the people that I was there with, they were pretty adamant that the other fellow had let down his part of a contract by not letting me know. He certainly got to the same end of the rope that I did, and for whatever reason knew that it ended. He didn't let me know that it ended. He went off to go and have a pee instead. And I think he just automatically assumed that I would be able to do just what he did, and for whatever reason I was distracted and hit the ground. These other people were very angry at him and really asked me a number of questions about how I could go climbing again with him and so on, and I've actually been out with him again, and we've talked about it quite a bit. But should I tell the sidebar story?
Go ahead, yeah.
This was kind of an interesting one. One of the people that I was with, who was very blameful of the other person, he and I went climbing a year later together and ended up in what could conceivably be construed as a similar kind of circumstance. But this time it was clearly, in one sense, my fault, and another sense his. I'll try and explain it briefly. We were on a sport climb, but it was a sport climb with 2 pitches. And he was under the impression that he was going to go up to the half rope mark and I would lower him back down again. I was under the impression that he was going to bring me up to the top of the first pitch and I'd do the second pitch. And it was very windy, and we just had this communication screw-up in which he gets up to the top of the pitch. He assumes I'm keeping him on the rope. We're yelling things back and forth. We can't really hear each other. I assume he's off the rope, so I untie from him. I sit down to put my shoes on. He shouts out, "Take," steps off the ledge, and falls about 60 feet before I catch him. And we've had lots of conversations about that since. But what's interesting is I think that in our conversations, he was so ready to blame the other person that I was with in the rappelling accident and was not so willing to blame me for what happened with the top roping accident, yet I think they're actually very similar in kind of context. And to me, to sum it all up from my point of view, and what I've been reading a lot about in the psychological, especially in the industry literature, is just that I think the thing that serves us best in this is to always assume that each of us has 100% responsibility. It's not 100% that we divide 50-50. It's 100% that I have, 100% that he has. Thereby, we have 200% responsibility, and you're far less likely to have a problem.
Arlene, would you like to jump in on the discussion?
To go ahead and
Yeah,
talk about...
yeah.
Well, on our Denali expedition, the thing I realized afterwards is I had so much wanted this women's ascent of Denali to work that I ignored the information that Grace had been sent back twice on Denali. So I kind of had the information, and indeed we took part in altitude tests before, and she got migraines while the rest of us were fine when we went up to 20,000 feet in an altitude chamber. And then, up to 14, she was incredibly strong, but suddenly she had all these problems, and I just wanted it to work so much that even though I had the information, I was kind of in denial about it. So that was, and then of course it seemed like a long time when Faye and I were sitting there with this unconscious person at 20,000 feet and clouds boiling around us, and I did a lot of thinking, and I oh shit, this was really stupid. Why did I get in this situation? I mean, I was 25 and she was 50, so it was hard to have done otherwise. And then on the subject of blame, when we finally got down and Grace returned to consciousness, she blamed us. She said we were hysterical women. If we'd given her a good kick, she would have gotten down the mountain fine. Because I think sometimes people don't want to admit their own weaknesses. So after she blamed us, I just felt, I erased that climb. I never thought about it. I never talked about it. And then the Portland Nazamas had a Denali conference, invited me to speak, and I was like, climbing the West Buttress, that's so boring. But I thought, well, I'll tell the story of Grace's rescue. It's kind of a good story. And I told it, and Vern Tejas, who is the head guide on Denali, came up. And he also was the first person to do a solo winter ascent of Denali. So he's a pretty good climber. To climb Denali solo in the winter, you climb it, carrying 2 ladders in the dark at 40 below zero. So he came up, and he said he'd never heard of anyone else getting someone unconscious down alive from the summit, and that we had done this amazing thing. And we didn't even know it, because I was so bummed at myself for not recognizing what was wrong. And the thing that I realized after I talked to Vern, which was 20 years after this happened, was, it seemed like a really bad thing, obviously, when I was sitting up there with this unconscious person, and it still seemed like a really bad thing when she was blaming us. But that actually it had given us a lot of confidence, and that we had been able to do the rescue and get her down alive. Turned out to have really jump-started our climbing careers, gave me a lot of confidence. I became a leader suddenly at age 25. So it was a really major thing in my career that maybe wasn't as negative as I thought during the process.
Ran, I'm wondering, when you come back or from an experience that has gone wrong, how important is it for you to sit down and really think about what went wrong and why it went wrong? And do you have like a structure for doing that, or do you just sort of think about it as thoughts come to you, or do you gather other team members together to have a formal meeting?
Yeah, being sort of ex-military, we like to do things in a structured fashion. Yeah, but I learned, the main lesson I learned, unfortunately, what went wrong with me was the fact that it was solo. Okay, therefore, unfortunately, I couldn't blame anybody. So, there's a lesson that's much more satisfactory to have someone else who you can blame. But so normally I do, and the problem has been both in the Arctic and the Antarctic. For many, many years, 2 decades, Charlie Burton was great. Then he got too fat, so we had to move to somebody else. And Mike Stroud used to always come on the expeditions. And I found that you were playing with the idea of doing a solo expedition or doing it with at least one other person, preferably not more than one. But then you've got big problems. So I don't know what the lesson was I learned. If you get cold hands, then, which is what happens fairly often, if you've got another person, they can get the tent up. So that's pretty vital. But you've got the downside of it, which is you sort of secretly hating them a lot of the time. And I can remember in London in a pub one day, Mike said to me, he was feeling honest, and he said, on that last expedition, the Canadian Arctic, I really hated you. And I knew that, of course, he was behind, because in an Arctic expedition, as you know, being Canadian, the polar bear will only go for the last person. So if there's 9 of you, it'll go for number 9. If there's only 2 of you, it'll go for the second one. Therefore, being leader, I always go first. And so Mike Stroud, who's behind, has the Ruger automatic 44 Magnum with him at all times. And he was saying, on this particular day, he spent the entire day planning how he would shoot me. He would do it on a day when we were close to open water, so he could get rid of the body. He worked out that the number of Scotland Yard and insurance people that would come up would be minimal. And so in the pub, this was quite funny. But 2 years later, when we were up there again and he was behind me again, and also in Antarctica, you've got to, very often one gets bad sort of gangrenous stuff in the feet, and you've got a couple of months still to go. Gangrene and crutch rot and all that make you irritable. And you get who do you get irritable with if you're by yourself? So it's self-destructive. So again, it's good to have someone with you who you can really, really blame. And inside the tent, you get very, very hungry. You're using 8,000 calories, you're only replacing it with 5,000. You really get hungry. And he's the cook, he's a nutritionist, he's got control of all the food. And every evening he opens the ration pack and you watch him. And the only thing which is really edible is the flapjacks. And there are two of them, they're handmade by somebody, and he decides which goes to who. And every time I could see that the one he gave me was smaller. I tried desperately not to say anything because it was sort of weak. But after about 80 days, I said, Mike, I think we ought to choose every other day which one we would have. And this is dead true. Even after that, when I'd chosen it, it still seemed smaller.
I'm surprised there aren't more fatalities on these expeditions.
So I think, basically speaking, it's very difficult to say whether I learnt a lesson that you shouldn't go solo or not, because there's pros and cons for both.
And you really have to expect the unexpected. I mean, you don't go out there thinking or believing that you're going to be totally safe. You accept the risk.
No, I wouldn't ever do
No?
anything that had a risk. We very... having said which, I drive in the UK, and my wife sometimes does drive, and I let her drive. So that would be about the most risky thing, I think.
Timmy, what about you? How do you, when a bad experience happens, you've made it now, you're back, home safe, what process do you go through?
Well, I immediately call my parents and blame them, actually, yeah. Call my mom and dad and just really ask them what went wrong with my childhood that made me go to this place, and risk my life like that in the first place. And then I'll blame my teachers. I'll call them up individually, blame a lot of my friends. And then ultimately I'll blame Bernadette McDonald and Deb Smythe for bringing me up here to make me part of this panel. But I mean, yeah, I'm the only person that's putting myself in that situation. I'm responsible for being up there on the lead. I mean, I'm isolated when I'm pushing the rope up there, so it's like I come back from it, and if you escape injury, like that's the best. Like if it's called near misses, right? This wasn't a direct hit. So you get bragging rights too. Like there is some bright side to it. Like if you break your legs badly or you get this epic accident or if you're confined to a chair or something, it's a buzzkill, right? You're like, yeah, I got hurt. It's kind of a bummer. But if you take this tremendous fall where you're, people are like, oh my gosh, you fell that far? How was it? I'm like, it was pretty cool, yeah. You have no idea what it felt like, So all of a sudden you're this really exceptional, freak, But actually what you did is you made this really bad mistake.
Yeah.
That could have been avoided if you simply didn't go and you stayed home. But even if you stay home, if you think about it, in the U.S., 48,000 people are killed each year in vehicles, right? And no one thinks about assessing the risk of driving, really. Maybe you do, Ran, when your wife is at the rear. But other than that, I mean, so it is exceptional to go into the mountains and to take these risks and things like that. But I mean, ultimately, all of us are to blame for our situations. That's it.
And Steve, when after your incident that you described, you were, in hospital for a long time, and you said you had a long time to think. So what did you think about?
One of the first big impacts actually wasn't in hospital for that long, but I was unable to work for quite a while. So I thought a lot about how my livelihood depended on being able to move around in the mountains. But like Timmy said, I think you choose to be there. It's a conscious choice, and like I alluded to before, it always starts with a desire to climb a mountain, a desire to go to the North Pole. So that didn't, in my case, die in any way. I went back and next year managed to climb the route. So I think that for a lot of us, it's just it's a double-edged sword because it's clearly it's risk means that there's some danger to your life, but at the same time, if that risk didn't exist, it probably wouldn't be interesting.
Yes, please. It's really for the whole panel. From the experiences which you've been through, are you able to identify and compare the relative importance of mental strength as opposed to physical strength and perhaps getting out of the situations you were in? And if mental strength perhaps was the really key point, are you able to identify where did that strength come from?
That's a really interesting question. I think that I want to put a slight spin on it because I was thinking of one of the things that Timmy and Steve were both saying. Sometimes the strength that we have to be able to deal with situations of risk is kind of an illusory strength. We convince ourselves that we're in control of situations that objectively perhaps we're not so in control of. So we do certain things to be able to try and control those situations. And part of that is just a rationalizing away of what's actually going on for us. And that can be a strength. It's probably a necessary strength at times, but it's also not a totally realistic one. It depends on the fact that human beings are really, really lousy statisticians. They don't add things up in the way that they actually work, but that keeps us alive. That allows us to go back after you've had a terrible accident, falling into a crevasse and hurting yourself. It allows you to go back again and be interested in doing it again, when most people wouldn't.
Anyone else want to, Ran?
When I'm choosing people, very often want them to be at a stage of very physically fit, so that they go a long, long way before they need to call upon their mental strength. Because the mental strength is a bit more dicey. So if on day 5 they're already getting wimpish and they have to start being mentally strong, that's not so good if they put it off until day 85. And when they do have to start being mentally strong, they need to be prepared for it, because I think most people, whether we're talking sort of vertical or horizontal, have got a wimpish voice inside their head which will try and find excuses for pulling out. And the key thing of being correct when you're doing these things is to work out exactly whether you're trying to make excuses for yourself or whether it is genuine and it would be irresponsible to continue. And that judgment is key, certainly to the leader of the expedition, and it's a very good thing if the people who are with you are good at making their own minds up about themselves, because on this sort of expedition, we are not very buddy-buddy. It's each man for himself to a large extent.
One thing I'd like to address is accident prevention, which, we're talking about our near misses. And a really good friend of mine named Jose Pereira, I was down in Patagonia climbing, and I was walking on this really loose talus hillside, and I wasn't paying attention, and a big block came down and crushed me, and I almost died. But what he told me after this, he sat me down and he said, what you really want to be doing is paying attention to change. Because oftentimes all of us are talking about this moments just before, except for maybe Arlene, because the woman was physically incapacitated. I knew, I could sense something was about to happen almost every time that these big accidents occur. And Jose told me, just be aware of change. If you find yourself floating away in some other area of your mind or thinking about back home or wherever it may be, you're not going to be present and able to basically, right the wrong that's about to occur.
What are your thoughts on the risk that you subject other members of your party to? When an accident occurs or something goes wrong, whoever is to blame, what are your feelings or thoughts on that aspect of risk?
Well, on our Denali trip, I'll say that we were pretty angry with Grace because we felt like she had really caused us all to risk our lives. So there was a lot of feeling about that, and that maybe that's why she was in denial that it had ever happened. So there was a fair amount of after she got down, there was like a 10-day storm, and we sat in our tents together for 10 days, and it was quite tense.
But I think Timmy's point of it being all of our choices to be there kind of answers that question as well. Again, if you follow the 200% thing that I was talking about before, it's up, somebody else chooses to come with me, that's their choice. They can try and decide, maybe in some of the same dimensions that Rand was talking about, why it's okay or not okay to go with me, but it's their choice.
That brings us up to a big change from the old days to now, because now so many people are climbing independently, so they're really on their own. And in the old days, everybody was pretty much a team. So if one person was ill, everybody would risk their lives and stop climbing for that one person. So it really was more of a team. I think that's a bit less true now, or depends, I suppose.
Yeah, I personally don't only climb in small teams, so it's not an issue if I tie into a rope with somebody. Both symbolically and in a very real way, that's a bond that goes beyond just climbing. It's also, if something goes wrong, that you deal with it together. And I've had cases where I've been hurt or injured or dropped a boot or whatever, And my partners had to pick up the slack and deal with me. And on the other hand, I've also had climbing partners that have been hurt from time to time, and I've had to deal with them in, sort of that sense. So.
I like your 100% rule a lot. I think if everybody went into it with that 100% rule, we would have a lot less blaming and get on with it more.
What about after it's already happened? And how do you climb back out of that after the epic? And it seems like you spent a period of time normalizing the situation, right, to recover. And justify or rationalizing or normalizing the situation as, Steve, I'm curious about that 2,000-foot climb back up or that hop back up on one leg. How you probably rationalized that or normalized that at the time and imagine this is perfectly normal. I'm just going to hop up on one leg, 2,000 feet. But then there's got to be some recovery time after that. Like, how do you get back to normal life? Does this question make sense to you?
Steve has never been normal, so he really can't return to normal life. So, yeah.
That's
And
the
it's not
actual
that I mean
answer.
normal, it's just that I think from my own experience I've been somewhat numb afterward, and it's very hard to come back.
Yeah, I guess there's a few questions inside there. The first one about immediately afterwards, the hopping back up or the self-rescue stage. I don't think there's for me, I don't know, it's different maybe in Arlene's situation, but there's never been too much time for reflection. It's just like, you got to deal with this, you got to go from A to B because it's safe at B and it's not safe at A. But I think in the longer term, of course you look back and you maybe look for the minute circumstances that caused you. The rope was cut in an accident a year ago, so it was too short, or the tab on my boot was halfway cut through, so when I pulled on it, it broke. Or you can think of these details that maybe quote unquote caused the actual accident, but I think in the end, I have to think about it in a bigger sense. What would I have been there in the first place? Like, why was I there in the first place? And for me, there's never a question personally that I would be there in the first place. I would, if I got that same weather forecast and I was there with that partner, I would still have gone and attempted the route. Had I known exactly what would happen, I probably would have been, interested in still going and having that experience.
Anyone else want to tackle that?
You're a sick man, dude. Yeah. But he brings up a really good point. Think about what draws us there in the first place. It's this uncontrollable desire to want to be in the most wildest, remote, furthest from safety place you can possibly be, and to never feel more alive than at that moment. And I totally agree. Like, you have this accident, but as long as you don't get hurt too badly, then you can go back. Or even if you have to have this long period of recuperation, you still will go back because you were there in the first place. You can't help it.
What is interesting, though, the psychological research, I'll put on my shrink hat here for a minute. Bear with me. The psychological research suggests that one of the reasons that we're able to do that is because what we do to ourselves is convince ourselves that it's okay to go, rather than really mitigate the circumstances that causes the problems in the first place. So we rationalize it more than change the things that cause the accident in the first place. And that's okay, because it allows us to continue doing things, but I think it's really important to recognize that you may not have corrected the problem that caused the problem in the first place.
Well, I think in a lot of these cases, not just these cases here, but I think if you open it up, to the experience of not only us, but our partners and the greater community, a lot of times it's these things like Timmy walking in the loose boulder field, or me just like not paying attention to a little bit of ice hidden underneath a couple of centimeters of snow. It's like it's the little stuff that actually gets you, I think.
I'm wondering if we've got an age range here among the panelists. I'm wondering if your desire and willingness to accept danger changes as you grow older.
Based on I'm 35, And based on my calculations, I have 7 more years.
7 more years, really?
Well, I found as soon as I knew I was going to become a mother that I no longer wanted to climb 8,000-meter peaks.
Okay.
Because and also at that point, when I started climbing, I thought mountains were the most beautiful, incredible place, and I was so optimistic. I remember on an early climb, a big avalanche covering my footprints from a few minutes ago and thinking, how beautiful.
Oh, how beautiful.
So I didn't get it.
Yeah.
But after a certain age, when I was about 25, about half my friends had died climbing, so I started to get it. And as soon as I became a mom, I was like, no way.
Geoff, how about you?
Well, I'm 48, so I'm going through a midlife crisis. So absolutely not. I will take just as many risks as I did when I was 25.
All right, right on. Sir Ran?
Well, when I was 48, I can't really remember that, but I think everything had sort of gone along till then, and I don't remember any big change. But at 60, I started thinking that because of my hand and all the rest of it, I shouldn't go anywhere very, very cold anymore, and should therefore, I didn't want to learn golf or fishing until I was 85. And so I thought I'd start to learn how to do what these guys do, which is to rock climb and ice climb. So I've just started the process now. And after a couple of years, if they say I'm okay, then I might start doing something worthwhile.
All right. Fishing or golfing? Timmy, what about you? What do you think? Because, of course, I think you're probably the youngest member of this panel.
I'm 18, that's right, yeah. What do I think about change in a person's life? I mean, I think it's the rare individual right here that keeps going into their later days. I mean, here there's Fred Becky. Fred Becky's this really famous Canadian guy that's been going forever. He's like 80-something. He still has this black book. He is so obsessed with climbing. He can't actually climb anymore, so now he gets off by just taking younger guys to the base of the climb and then kind of hanging out, right? Mm-hmm. Because he just can't get enough, right? I can get enough, right? But I haven't gotten enough yet. But I imagine that at some point, I mean, everybody changes in their lives, mm-hmm. right? You keep turning chapters of the book of your life, and mine isn't, it's not titled climbing, so I've stopped climbing expeditions lately, but I'll go back to them, Now I'm kind of making more films and hanging out and, being underemployed. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think I'll always rock climb. And as far as assessing risk, I mean, I grew up as a kid whitewater kayaking. I was like one of 7 children. We were all kayaking, class 5 whitewater. We accused my dad of trying to cull the herd because he had too many mouths to feed. But we all stuck with him. Most of them live at home still, yeah. He's a tireless worker, yeah. But so, I mean, I think that I became kind of inured to risk. So it's just like, your assessment of risk is different than mine.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
And one thing for you, Ran, I'm putting it out there to take you rock climbing when you get the skills to pay the bills. Yeah.
What's your fee?
What's my fee? You give me some humor lessons first of all. I can work on that dry kind of British humor. Yeah. I will. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I think it's clear to everyone in this room the lure that mountains have for people, and all people can be drawn to mountains without feeling the need to climb them, to get into risky situations. And I'm wondering, is it the danger? Do you do it because of the danger or in spite of the danger?
I do it for the chicks.
How's that been working out for you, Timmy?
My bed is being warmed as we speak, all right? Yeah. And it's a giant bed, too. I mean, you can, play tic-tac-toe with bodies on it.
Does that answer your question, Kathy?
This is a family show, I've been told.
Are you done now?
I've only just begun, yeah.
Geoff Powter.
Help her, Geoff.
Someone I
Yeah.
can count on here. Someone who has to live in the community.
You know, we've answered that up here a number of times. It's through the risk. We do it. If you take the risk out, like Steve said, it becomes a little bit less interesting. You leave it in there, that's fantastic. But the whole game is about measuring that and trying to work with it. That's part of why we do it.
Steve? I guess the same for you, really. Is it?
I'd never really thought about it in those terms, but as Geoff said that, it makes sense. But you know, individuals and even within different disciplines of climbing, there's different accepted sort of levels of risk in different activities, different sub-activities, and for different people. And you know, we think of risk in two kinds of objective and subjective. The subjective risk being the kind that basically results from your failure, your mistake, your fall. The objective being the storm comes in or the rock falls or whatever. So there's lots of ways we think about those different things. But I think especially, you know, we couldn't really do without either one.
I was going to say, I've always suffered from acute optimism, so I just ignored the risk for many, many years and really didn't pay any attention to it and really didn't believe that it was there, which is perhaps a bit dumb, but, you know, kind of, because I consider myself not a risk taker, so.
Denial, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I only ride my bike on trails where it's safe. I've always considered it too dangerous to ride my bike on the roads. And I always say that the most dangerous part of climbing is driving home afterwards.
What is it that you, the panelists, would like the audience to take away from this discussion today? You've shared obviously your passion for climbing and mountaineering and adventuring and expeditions, but what is it that you might like the audience to take away today?
For me, it's definitely the question. I think a lot of the research into error and accidents says overarches everything, which is that you have to perceive the possibility of accidents as a matter of not if, but when.
Okay. And we have another question here.
So we're talking a lot about risk and repercussions and blames and whatnot. Behind all this, for me, is the concept of death. Where does that enter into this for you in your conceptualization as you're entering into risk?
Preventing death is what we're talking about at all costs, like trying to avoid it. Yeah, I think. Just holding it at bay as long as possible.
Well, it has led to a decrease in my optimism level, you know, and when I've gone on expeditions where people have died, I've usually had a period where I've decided I'm not going to climb anymore, that it's not worth it, and then for some unknown reason or complicated reasons, I usually find myself climbing again. But, you know, when you asked about something to take away, I think I would really encourage people to figure out what it is they really want to do and what they feel passionate about and rewarded by, and not to think too much about the risk. Because if you worry too much about the risk, then you kind of stay home and you'll get obesity, and that's the worst of all. So.
Yeah, we have a problem, obviously, with the longer expeditions, because once you set out, you put a lot of effort into it, sometimes 7 years to organize an expedition, and then one of the guys dies en route. Which is obviously annoying to the overall aim. So what you've got to do is to avoid the aftermath, which is the next of kin of the dead one getting at you, because you didn't stop. And so what we do is, before we leave, is to have a form, and we get the next of kin of everybody to sign it, saying that they agree that if their nearest and dearest dies en route, that we'll have a short Christian service, but otherwise we'll carry on and not waste time sort of, you know, having a helicopter waiting for a twin otter to come in and remove the body. So we sort of paint the picture as if it might happen, and everything is sort of organized in readiness in case it does up front. Yeah.
And has that, I mean, seriously, has in those situations, has the family then accepted that, or has there been repercussions?
Well, in 36 years, we've only had one death, and that was on board the ship.
Yeah.
And this guy probably had a hole in the heart anyway, which we didn't know about. So we haven't actually had to face that en route,
Yeah.
and we haven't had too many bad injuries. But if it did happen, we would at least be able to point to the fact that that person needn't have joined if he or she didn't want to join. What you were saying earlier on, Geoff, everybody goes on these expeditions because they want to, and so why blame afterwards?
Right.
Question about the range of emotions just after the near-death experience. I'm hearing a lot of anger at the beginning. When does the laughter and the humor kick in? And how
Today.
does it help you cope with the whole thing that happened?
Well, I think the laughter is kind of getting over it, right? I mean, I think immediately, I remember when I took my massive fall, I was in tears because I was so bummed out that we weren't going to be able to complete our climb. You know, and I was really happy, too, that I wasn't, you know, destroyed or killed, of course. But, I mean, the humor started immediately for me. I mean, I was, you know, on the way down, we were cracking jokes about it. I mean, having fun with the Mexican dudes. I mean, cruising down, and, like, our cook came up to me, and Ghulam Muhammad, this Baltistani guy, and he's like, the hand of Allah caught you and then threw you into the wall to teach you a lesson. And I was like, yeah, all right, cha-cha, you know? I mean, it's like, you gotta be psyched if you're alive. I mean, right? You just gotta be stoked, so, yeah.
I was taking oxycodone afterwards. It was really funny. It was great.
My perception of this is a bit different. It's called near misses, but I think of every one of those events as sort of sublethal hits. And it's sort of in my mind, a near miss is when something happens but there are no severe consequences, and hopefully that's what you learn from. And with the panel, how do you feel? Do you think there are usually good warning signs in advance of these things, or is it something that just sort of catches you off guard and then you learn from it afterwards?
Well, I mentioned it earlier from my friend Jose saying paying attention to change, right? Like these subtle things. Like I knew that little piece of equipment up there, I didn't test it, and I knew that it could come out, but I still stood on it anyway. You know, I mean, so it's like you knew as you're pulling that sledge across the ice that it could potentially drag you in, but you kind of have to keep going, right? So you're sort of assessing risk as you continue to go up or continue to do whatever it is you're doing. And if your goal is to get to the end, and in whatever style, then you're just going to continue to go, right? And when something happens and goes wrong, then it's time to reconsider, you know, that the certain style that you were climbing in or adventuring in. I
guess part of my question is, does it make you a safer climber afterwards, and do you learn to pick up, I guess, better cues that you might have missed the first time?
I hope so.
Yeah.
You know, basically, yeah. I'm not sure if it does.
I sure know in our case, I've always been real picky about people I go on expeditions with. And when I sort of want, you know, there's a thing where you really want something a lot, so you ignore a lot of evidence. I mean, in a way, in many cases, that's what we're doing. You know, we want to make a climb or cross some water, and we kind of ignore the information. And we certainly were ignoring information. So I try really hard when some adverse information floats into my brain to listen to it.
Thank you for those questions, and thank you to our audience for being here and taking part in this. Thank you.